For a decade, America worshipped Cliff and Claire Huxtable, the funny doctor and the powerful lawyer. But you were brainwashed by NBC's PR machine in the most horrifying way possible. The image of America's dad smiling next to his perfect moral wife wasn't just acting, it was a calculated human shield. While the sitcom generated billions, the network created an absolute safe zone for a predator. They weaponized our trust in family values to silence the victims. This is the story of Bill Cosby and Phylicia Rashad, and the most disturbing cover-up behind NBC's The Cosby Show. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the American entertainment industry was undergoing a massive ideological shift. The cultural rebellion of the previous decade was exhausting itself, and network executives were desperately searching for a lucrative return to traditional grounded family dynamics. NBC, as a corporate entity, was bleeding cash and teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. They trailed dead last in the network ratings. Bill Cosby surveyed this fractured landscape and recognized a monumental corporate vulnerability. He was already a highly successful stand-up comedian and actor, but his public image carried the distinct, lingering residue of a 1970s playboy. There were already muted industry whispers, subtle warnings exchanged in comedy clubs and Hollywood backrooms, detailing a lifestyle of calculated manipulation and dark, unchecked appetites. He knew that a solo act could only generate revenue, but a sanitized family brand could generate absolute power. He required a cultural fortress to insulate himself from his own private reality. But a fortress cannot stand without a bedrock of unassailable respectability. He needed an anchor. He needed an alibi. The blueprint for this alibi was incredibly specific. A passive, subservient television wife would fail the psychological test of the modern audience. A weak partner would inadvertently look like a victim, drawing the wrong kind of scrutiny. Cosby needed a formidable, highly educated, and sophisticated archetype. He needed a woman whose sheer presence communicated an ironclad moral authority. Whether intentional or not, the casting of Phylicia Rashad provided the ultimate corporate deterrent. She possessed a formidable, highly educated archetype that communicated ironclad moral authority. Rashad was a phenomenally talented stage actress, possessing a regal posture and a commanding theatrical voice. However, the economic reality for a black stage actress in the early 1980s was notoriously brutal. The theater provided artistic purity, but absolutely no financial security. The systemic cruelty of the entertainment hierarchy dictated that immense talent was frequently starved into submission. Rashad possessed the dignity of a Broadway veteran, but faced the grinding, exhausting financial anxiety of a working actor navigating a system designed to exploit desperation. When Cosby and Rashad met, a silent, binding transaction occurred. The network executives watched the immediate chemistry and saw a lifeline for their failing corporation. Cosby looked at Rashad and saw the ultimate deterrent against his detractors. Rashad looked at the television contract and saw an exit from financial instability. It was a Faustian bargain masked as a groundbreaking sitcom pilot. The trauma of this arrangement was woven into its very foundation. Rashad was stepping into a rigid corporate structure where her primary function was to legitimize a compromised man. She provided the theatrical weight and the undeniable class that elevated Cosby from a comedian with a questionable reputation to America's most trusted father figure. In exchange, The network provided her with a level of global visibility and financial compensation that simply did not exist anywhere else in the industry. She traded the autonomy of the stage for the golden handcuffs of network television. The character she was hired to portray was a masterclass in psychological misdirection. She played a powerful, no-nonsense lawyer who demanded absolute respect and intellectual parity from her husband. The audience immediately absorbed a flawed but deeply comforting logic. They naturally assumed that a man capable of respecting a fiercely independent woman on screen could not possibly harbor a predatory contempt for women behind closed doors. If she trusted him, the world could trust him. Rashad's flawless, unwavering execution of this role gave the network the exact excuse they needed to perpetually look the other way. The corporate executives were not blind. They were heavily incentivized to ignore the darkness. As long as Rashad hit her marks and projected absolute marital solidarity, the executives could pretend the studio was a safe environment. They willingly chose the comfort of their profit margins over the safety of the vulnerable women walking onto their lot. As production geared up for the first season, the physical layout of the Brooklyn studio became the staging ground for two entirely separate realities. The main set was a brightly lit sanctuary of laughter, moral lessons, and wholesome family conflict. Rashad operated exclusively within this lighted zone. She established a strict professional perimeter, managing her dialogue and maintaining an unyielding focus on the work. She adhered to an absolute compartmentalization, surviving the chaotic machinery of television production by staying strictly within her designated professional lane. But just yards away from this manufactured warmth, a completely different dynamic was being constructed in the shadows. The immediate staggering success of the early episodes granted Cosby a terrifying level of unchecked corporate authority. He was no longer just an actor, he was the savior of NBC. This leverage meant no producer, no executive, and certainly no security guard would dare question his movements or his guests. He began to utilize his private dressing room as an insulated hunting ground. Young, aspiring actresses, models, and low-level staff members were invited into this private space under the guise of career mentorship. They did not feel they were walking into a trap because the environment had been thoroughly sanitized by the proximity of the television family. They accepted drinks and took pills because the man offering them was married to the most respected woman on television. The trap was set, the cameras were rolling, and the most devastating cover-up in media history had officially commenced. By 1985, the sitcom was no longer a mere television program. It was a macroeconomic phenomenon. It single-handedly resurrected the national broadcasting company from financial ruin, shifting the balance of power in the American media landscape. This unprecedented success instantly transformed the dynamics on the Brooklyn soundstage. The leverage Cosby held morphed into absolute unquestioned sovereignty. He was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising revenue and syndication deals. In the ruthless hierarchy of the 1980s entertainment industry, a man who dictates the financial survival of a conglomerate is rarely subject to human resources oversight. He effectively owned the network, the studio, and everyone working within its walls. This monumental shift in power solidified the psychological trap for Phylicia Rashad, locking the doors of the golden cage she had willingly entered just a year prior. To understand the specific trauma of Rashad's position during these peak years, one must analyze the brutal mechanics of Hollywood survival. She had achieved the financial security she desperately needed, but the currency of that security was her continuous, unwavering participation in a massive public deception. The corporate system is inherently cruel because it operates on a transactional morality. Network executives were fully aware of the dark industry whispers. They saw the constant rotation of young, vulnerable women being escorted into a heavily guarded dressing room. They possessed the authority to intervene, yet they actively chose silence. They calculated that the financial risk of confronting their star far outweighed the human cost of his predatory behavior. They built a protective infrastructure around him, employing fixers, publicists, and security personnel whose primary directive was to sanitize his environment and manage any potential fallout. Rashad was forced to operate inside this deeply corrupted ecosystem, fully aware that the men signing her historic paychecks were the same men facilitating a predator's access to his victims. This realization creates a profound cognitive dissonance. For Rashad, compartmentalization could no longer function merely as a professional acting technique. It had to evolve into a rigorous psychological survival mechanism. For Rashad, compartmentalization evolved into a rigorous psychological survival mechanism. She projected an aura of unshakable domestic safety while navigating a deeply toxic corporate hierarchy. The mental toll of bridging that gap was staggering. Breaking character or questioning the machinery meant immediate professional annihilation. The network would not protect her. The industry, historically hostile to women who disrupt profitable enterprises, would blacklist her. She was a black woman in the 1980s television landscape. Her unprecedented power was entirely conditional, tethered completely to the man standing next to her. Her silence was not simply requested. It was the unwritten, non-negotiable clause in her contract. The public relations machinery of the era further deepened this trauma by aggressively merging the actors with their fictional counterparts. The network's marketing strategy relied heavily on blurring the lines between reality and television. Cosby and Rashad were deployed across the country as a unified moral front. They were interviewed on national talk shows, not as actors promoting a script, but as cultural authorities discussing family dynamics and societal values. They smiled on the covers of major magazines, projecting the warmth of America's ideal couple. For Rashad, these media tours were psychological endurance tests. She was required to sit under the harsh glare of journalistic scrutiny and continuously validate a man whose private actions contradicted everything their show represented. Every time she publicly praised his genius or spoke of their profound mutual respect, she was laying another brick in the wall that shielded him from accountability. The lie was compounding, becoming so massive and so widely accepted that it effectively overwrote the truth in the public consciousness. As the decade progressed and the syndication deals cemented the show's legacy into a billion-dollar empire, the isolation of her position became absolute. The wealth generated by the program created a suffocating wall of complicity. Dozens of crew members, writers, and executives were buying houses and funding their children's educations through the continued success of the brand. Everyone had a vested, desperate interest in keeping the machine running smoothly. This collective dependency fostered an environment of aggressive, willful ignorance. If Rashad harbored any moral agonizing over the reality occurring just yards away from her dressing room, she had absolutely no safe harbor in which to express it. To voice a concern was to threaten the livelihoods of hundreds of people. The system masterfully weaponized the financial security of the crew to enforce a code of absolute silence. Rashad was trapped in a paradox. She was the most visible woman on television, adored by millions, yet professionally and psychologically marooned on an island of corporate complicity. She adapted to this grim reality by adopting an impenetrable posture of professional detachment. She restricted her interactions, focused obsessively on the mechanics of her craft, and refused to acknowledge the shadows lengthening across the studio lot. She became the perfect, efficient employee of a corrupt corporation. But survival through detachment requires shutting down a fundamental part of one's own humanity. The audience watched Claire Huxtable dismantle injustice with fierce eloquence on their screens, entirely unaware that the woman playing her was actively surviving an environment defined by silent systemic exploitation. The television wife was a masterpiece of strength, but the actress was a hostage to the very success she helped generate. The architecture of the cover-up was now fully functional, operating with terrifying efficiency as the 1980s drew to a close and the protective bubble of the sitcom began to show its first microscopic signs of strain. When the final episode of the original sitcom aired in the spring of 1992, the physical set in Brooklyn was dismantled, but the psychological architecture of the cover-up remained entirely intact. The conclusion of the series marked a dangerous operational shift for the network and their star. For 8 years, Bill Cosby had relied on the daily televised validation of his pristine family dynamic to insulate his private actions from public scrutiny. He possessed a daily tangible alibi. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, that protective bubble instantly evaporated. He was untethered from the domestic environment that had sanitized his public image. Stepping away from the rigid structure of the television lot, he attempted to navigate the 1990s entertainment landscape solely on the strength of his standalone brand. But isolation is the greatest enemy of a manufactured facade. Without the formidable grounding presence of his television wife standing beside him, the fraying edges of his solo persona became increasingly visible to industry insiders. The early to mid-1990s were a period of intense vulnerability for Cosby's legacy. The underground network of whispers, previously contained by the sheer financial gravity of the sitcom, began to echo louder in the back rooms of Hollywood and comedy clubs. He was operating without his primary character witness. The stories circulating among young actresses and industry staff were no longer easily dismissed as jealous rumors. They were forming a distinct, undeniable pattern of predatory behavior, exploitation, and highly calculated manipulation. Corporate handlers and publicists who had spent the previous decade burying these allegations recognized a shifting tide. The cultural climate was slowly changing, and the aura of the untouchable father figure was fundamentally incompatible with the reality of his solo behavior. The corporate entities that still profited massively from his syndication rights understood that his public image required an immediate and drastic stabilization before the rumors breached the mainstream press. Simultaneously, Phylicia Rashad was experiencing a temporary, deceptive form of liberation. Exiting the rigid constraints of the sitcom allowed her to return to the theater, her original artistic sanctuary. Leaving the Brooklyn studio was akin to surviving a prolonged hostage situation where the ransom was paid in historic syndication checks. The stage offered a place of artistic honesty, a stark and vital contrast to the fundamental dishonesty she had been forced to maintain on the television lot. She attempted to wash off the heavy psychological residue of the corporate cover-up, immersing herself in complex, challenging roles that required authentic emotional labor rather than sanitized PR posturing. For a brief window, she was allowed to exist simply as a master craftsman, detached from the exhausting duty of legitimizing a compromised man. However, the American entertainment system is uniquely punishing to those who attempt to walk away from highly profitable brand associations. The cruelty of the Hollywood system for a mature actress in the 1990s was absolute and structural. The system had permanently branded her as the television wife. While the theater provided intellectual and artistic fulfillment, it could not match the financial security or the global visibility she had grown accustomed to. More significantly, the casting directors in Los Angeles and New York suffered from a collective lack of imagination. They looked at a brilliant, classically trained actress and saw only the mother from a sitcom. The industry actively starved her of diverse on-screen opportunities, implicitly demanding that she remain in the specific narrow box she had occupied for a decade. The financial anxiety, the very vulnerability that had forced her into the initial contract in the 1980s, slowly began to creep back into her reality. The trap had never truly been dismantled. She had simply been granted a longer leash. By 1996, the vulnerability of Cosby's standalone image reached a critical threshold. The CBS network had heavily invested in a new sitcom designed to serve as his triumphant return to prime time. However, the initial development and early reception were disastrously weak. The network executives realized with terrifying clarity that the American public did not implicitly trust Bill Cosby, the man. They trusted the partnership. They trusted the specific domestic dynamic he had previously occupied. To salvage their massive financial investment, CBS executed a strategic, high-stakes public relations maneuver. They made the emergency call. They needed the ultimate credibility anchor to reactivate the shield. They approached Phylicia Rashad to return to the screen, essentially asking her to resume her post as the warden of his public morality. This corporate recall presented Rashad with a devastating psychological dilemma. Returning to television alongside him meant willfully stepping back into the shadow of a man she knew was deeply compromised. It meant reactivating the precise trauma she had just spent 4 years trying to deconstruct. She was an older, wiser woman now, fully aware of the dark machinery operating just off camera. But the system is meticulously designed to make refusal professionally and financially devastating. To decline the offer was to risk permanent exile from the highest tiers of network television. She was cornered by the very legacy she had helped build. The network offered a highly lucrative contract, banking on the predictable economic pressures facing an actress in her late 40s. It was a coercive transaction stripped of any artistic merit. They were not buying her acting ability. They were explicitly purchasing her credibility to mask his liability. When the news of the reunion was announced, the public relations rollout was aggressive and flawless. The network heavily weaponized the nostalgia of the audience. They sold the reunion to the press by leaning entirely into a manufactured television soulmate narrative. They placed the two actors on magazine covers and daytime talk shows, orchestrating a seamless continuation of the illusion that had captured the country a decade prior. For the public, seeing that specific woman standing next to that specific man was a profound psychological comfort. It functioned as an immediate visual character reference. The audience subconsciously concluded that if this highly intelligent, fiercely respectable woman was willing to share a screen with him again, the quiet, persistent rumors regarding his dark appetites must be entirely false. This second contract marked a tragic evolution in Rashad's complicity. During the 1980s, her silence could be analyzed as a survival mechanism within an unprecedented corporate anomaly. By 1996, however, her participation was an active, deliberate reactivation of a known cover-up. She was no longer a young actress securing her financial footing. She was a seasoned industry veteran, consciously lending her pristine reputation to a man who desperately required a shield. The psychological toll of this era was hidden beneath a veneer of professional maturity. She managed the set, delivered her lines with characteristic brilliance, and smiled for the promotional cameras, all while fully understanding the devastating function she was serving. She was reinforcing the fortress, ensuring that the predator remained safely hidden behind the skirts of America's favorite television wife as the new millennium approached. The turn of the millennium marked the end of their second corporate deployment. When the CBS sitcom quietly concluded its run in the year 2000, the immediate daily utility of the television wife was no longer required. Bill Cosby had successfully navigated the dangerous waters of the 1990s, using Phylicia Rashad to reestablish his baseline of moral authority. He emerged into the new century not just as a wealthy comedian, but as an untouchable cultural institution, untethered once again from the daily constraints of a television schedule. He began to weaponize his newly fortified public image in a profoundly cynical manner. He transitioned from a benevolent television father to a harsh, uncompromising public moralist. He toured the country delivering blistering lectures, publicly castigating impoverished communities for their perceived moral failings and lack of traditional family structures. He stood behind podiums demanding strict adherence to respectability politics, effectively using his manufactured television legacy as a bludgeon against the vulnerable. This aggressive posturing was the ultimate psychological camouflage. He calculated that a society would never suspect a man who so loudly and viciously demanded moral perfection of harboring a monstrous reality in his private life. While he was busy building this new aggressive public persona, the legal architecture that had protected him for decades finally encountered a threat it could not simply intimidate into silence. In early 2004, a woman named Andrea Constant filed a civil lawsuit. This represented a catastrophic shift in the operational reality of the cover-up. For decades, the network of handlers, publicists, and high-priced fixers had successfully managed industry rumors and private accusations. A rumor can be denied. An anonymous whisper can be discredited. But a civil lawsuit is a tangible legal mechanism that demands a formal response under the penalty of perjury. It forces the dark reality of the dressing room into the rigid, documented environment of the justice system. The lawsuit meticulously detailed a horrifying pattern of chemical manipulation and predatory behavior. It was the first structural crack in the fortress that the syndication dollars had built. The corporate executives who still relied heavily on the residual income from the 1980s sitcom watched this development with absolute terror, realizing that their highly profitable moral monument was facing an existential legal threat. The crisis deepened exponentially the following year during the discovery phase of the civil suit. In 2005, Cosby was forced into a legal deposition. Stripped of his public relations team and his carefully scripted television dialogue, he was compelled to answer questions under oath. In that sterile room, the facade was completely dismantled. He admitted on the legal record to actively acquiring highly potent sedatives with the explicit intention of administering them to young women he wished to exploit. This was the forensic truth the industry had ignored for 30 years, finally captured in black and white. It laid bare the absolute cruelty of the power dynamic he had operated. He did not rely on charm or seduction. He relied on the total chemical eradication of a woman's capacity to consent or resist. The deposition confirmed that the safe, welcoming environment of his television empire was merely the bait for a highly organized predatory operation. However, the justice system in the early 2000s was inherently designed to protect immense wealth and cultural power. The lawyers representing the comedian executed the standard brutal maneuver reserved for the elite. They reached a financial settlement, and the devastating contents of that deposition were immediately sealed by a judge. The truth was legally buried. The public remained completely blind to the confession, and the lucrative syndication contracts continued without interruption. The system functioned flawlessly, proving that in the modern entertainment industry, truth is simply a commodity that can be purchased and locked away in a vault if the defendant possesses sufficient capital. The monster was allowed to return to his moral crusades, his legacy bruised but fundamentally intact. The chronological reality of this specific period reveals a chilling, perfectly timed dichotomy in the life of Phylicia Rashad. At the exact moment the legal machinery was forcing her former co-star to confess his predatory methodology in a sealed deposition, she was experiencing the absolute zenith of her professional and artistic life. In 2004, she returned to Broadway in a revival of A Raisin in the Sun. Her performance was a towering achievement of emotional depth and raw, unfiltered humanity. She received universal critical acclaim, and that spring she made history by becoming the first black actress to win the Tony Award for Best Performance by a leading actress in a play. She stood on the stage of Radio City Music Hall, holding the highest honor in the American theater, universally respected and artistically validated. She had completely shed the restrictive, two-dimensional skin of the sitcom wife and emerged as a theatrical titan. This massive triumph necessitated a highly tactical and ruthlessly calculated survival strategy regarding the escalating legal crisis of her former television husband. When the headlines of the civil suit first broke, breaking the decades of enforced industry silence, Rashad executed a masterful silent retreat. She did not issue a statement of unwavering support, nor did she offer a syllable of condemnation. She simply vanished from the narrative. During the television years, she was contractually and financially obligated to serve as his character witness. But she was no longer on his payroll. She was the toast of Broadway, operating in a prestigious artistic sphere that demanded absolute separation from sordid legal scandals. She recognized with lethal clarity that stepping into the blast radius of a sexual assault lawsuit would instantly contaminate her historic theatrical achievement. The Hollywood system had trained her to be acutely aware of brand management, and she knew her newly minted status as a Tony-winning dramatic actress required complete isolation from his collapsing moral facade. Her silence during the 2005 deposition era was not born of ignorance. It was a deeply sophisticated exercise in plausible deniability. She leaned heavily on the fact that the legal documents were sealed. Because the general public did not have access to his sworn confession, she could safely pretend the crisis did not exist. She compartmentalized the reality of the lawsuit with the same brutal efficiency she had used to compartmentalize the reality of the Brooklyn studio lot in the 1980s. She focused entirely on her stage work, her accolades, and her academic pursuits. She allowed the high-priced lawyers to handle the wreckage while she preserved her own pristine legacy. This calculated distance reveals the ultimate, cold reality of institutional survival. When the ship finally hits the iceberg, the loyal lieutenant does not go down with the captain. The lieutenant secures the first place on the lifeboat. Yet this tactical silence carried a profound, unacknowledged psychological weight. By refusing to engage with the reality of the civil suit, she was implicitly abandoning the women who were bravely attempting to hold a massive cultural institution accountable. She knew the environment he operated in better than anyone alive. She knew the specific layout of the studios, the rotating cast of young guest stars, and the absolute terrifying power he wielded over everyone on the payroll. But the system had rewarded her silence with historic fame in the 1980s, and now it was rewarding her silence with prestigious theatrical awards in the 2000s. The incentive structure of the entertainment industry actively demands complicity in exchange for continuous elevation. She chose the safety of the stage over the terrifying disruption of the truth. She preserved her masterpiece, leaving the victims to fight a billionaire's legal team entirely on their own, completely unaware that the digital age was rapidly approaching to tear down the walls of the vault where the truth was hidden. For nearly a decade, following the sealed settlement of 2005, a profound and deeply artificial peace descended upon the legacy of the television empire. This period represents the ultimate triumph of the 20th century Hollywood defense mechanism. The system was designed by highly paid legal architects to achieve one singular objective: containment. By utilizing out-of-court financial settlements and deploying aggressive ironclad non-disclosure agreements, the corporate apparatus successfully confined a horrific predatory history to the absolute margins of the entertainment industry. The trauma inflicted upon the survivors during this specific decade was a unique form of psychological torture. They were legally bound to silence, forced under the threat of absolute financial ruin to keep the secrets of a billionaire. Meanwhile, they had to watch the man who exploited them continue to be celebrated as an elder statesman of American morality. They had to watch him embark on lucrative lecture tours, standing behind podiums to deliver harsh judgments on the ethics of the working class. The legal system had effectively weaponized their own poverty against them, purchasing their silence to maintain the commercial viability of a television property. The syndication checks continued to flow seamlessly into the bank accounts of the network executives, proving that corporate complicity operates smoothly as long as the legal paperwork is meticulously filed. The demographic that had originally sustained the sitcom in the 1980s had now aged into their 50s and 60s. They had raised their own children using the Huxtable household as a functional moral compass. The network syndication strategy relied entirely on this deep, unexamined nostalgia. Because the legal settlement had successfully prevented a public criminal trial, the corporations could comfortably feign ignorance. They kept the reruns playing in millions of living rooms every single day, reinforcing the psychological conditioning of the audience. The public continued to consume the product exactly as intended, completely unaware that they were providing the daily viewership statistics required to sustain a criminal cover-up. The corporate executives understood that nostalgia is a highly lucrative commodity, and they ruthlessly protected it from the toxic reality contained within the sealed court documents. The illusion was functioning with terrifying perfection, demonstrating how a society can be systematically trained to fiercely love a monster, provided the monster is packaged within a familiar, comforting half-hour broadcast. During this long stretch of enforced corporate amnesia, Phylicia Rashad solidified her position within the elite sanctuaries of high culture. The calculated distance she established during the civil suit had proven to be a highly effective survival strategy. She had successfully navigated the blast radius of the initial allegations by simply refusing to acknowledge their existence. In the elite circles of Broadway and regional theater, a polite, rigid code of silence is strictly enforced. It is an environment that prioritizes artistic prestige and actively discourages the discussion of television scandals. Rashad was protected by this class barrier. She continued to accept prestigious roles, direct critically acclaimed stage productions, and collect academic honors. She built an impenetrable fortress of high culture around herself, effectively insulating her daily reality from the sordid, violent truth of her former co-star. This period of her life illustrates the chilling capacity of the human mind to compartmentalize. She had adapted to living adjacent to a dormant volcano, convincing herself that because the legal system had capped the crater, the lava simply did not exist. She operated with the absolute confidence of a woman who believed the architecture of 20th century media control would hold forever. However, the defense mechanisms that had protected the empire for 30 years were fundamentally analog tools. They relied entirely on the ability to control a small, concentrated group of media gatekeepers. High-priced publicists could intimidate print editors. Network executives could kill unfavorable television news segments. Lawyers could bury legal documents in physical vaults. This system was impenetrable, but it was completely unequipped for the velocity, decentralization, and absolute democratization of the digital age. The internet was rapidly dismantling the traditional hierarchies of information. The power to shape a cultural narrative was shifting from the corporate boardrooms of Manhattan to the smartphones of the general public. The architects of the cover-up, men who operated in a world of fax machines and closed-door handshakes entirely failed to recognize the existential threat posed by the digital revolution. They believed they still controlled the narrative because they still controlled the television stations. In October 2014, the impenetrable fortress was breached, but the attack did not originate from an investigative journalist or a sudden prosecutorial awakening. It originated from a smartphone camera in a small comedy club in Philadelphia. During a routine performance, comedian Hannibal Buress bypassed the polite industry whispers and directly, aggressively addressed the decades of allegations. He did not couch his words in legal disclaimers. He stated the crimes plainly to a live audience, specifically mocking the comedian's hypocritical public moralizing. An audience member recorded the routine and uploaded the unpolished footage to the internet. The digital spark bypassed the gatekeepers entirely. There were no network executives to kill the broadcast. There were no publicists to spin the narrative. The algorithm simply detected engagement and pushed the video to millions of screens within 48 hours. That single low-resolution video accomplished in 2 days what years of complex legal struggles and private agony had failed to achieve. It bypassed the corporate shield and detonated directly in the center of the public consciousness. The viral acceleration of the video caused a catastrophic system failure within the public relations machinery. The old guard of handlers attempted to deploy their standard tactics of denial and deflection, but they were immediately overwhelmed by the sheer volume of digital scrutiny. As the video circulated, it shattered the enforced isolation of the survivors. For decades, the legal strategy had been to separate the women, intimidate them individually, and make them feel entirely alone against a billion-dollar machine. The internet destroyed that isolation. Women who had carried the trauma of chemical manipulation and exploitation for decades suddenly saw their own buried truth trending globally. The digital landscape provided a terrifying safety in numbers. They began to step forward not through heavily vetted press releases, but through direct, unfiltered digital testimonies. The corroborating accounts flooded the public sphere in rapid, undeniable succession. The sheer scale and forensic consistency of the allegations stripped away the nostalgia of the 1980s. The public was violently forced to look back at the pristine television living room and recognize it for what it truly was: the heavily financed staging ground for a serial predator. The sudden, brutal collapse of the facade sent a shock wave through the corporate infrastructure. The television networks, previously content to collect syndication revenue while ignoring the sealed depositions, were suddenly faced with a massive consumer revolt. Millions of dollars in advertising were instantly attached to a trending topic of horrific exploitation. The brand became radioactive overnight, but the public fury did not stop with the perpetrator. When a cultural monument of that magnitude collapses, the public demands accountability from the entire supply chain of complicity. The audience, naturally and aggressively, pivoted their attention toward the architects of the shield. The spotlight swung violently toward Phylicia Rashad. The safe, highly curated distance she had maintained since the civil suit was rapidly disintegrating. The digital age did not respect the polite boundaries of Broadway or the hallowed halls of academia. The internet possesses a permanent, unforgiving memory. Social media platforms were suddenly flooded with images and video clips of Rashad standing next to him, validating his morality, and selling the illusion of their perfect television marriage. She was trapped by the digital footprint of her own 30-year performance as the ultimate character witness. The media and the public required her to reconcile the horrifying, undeniable reality of the man with the flawless, highly profitable fiction she had helped maintain. The silence she had relied upon for a decade was no longer a viable survival strategy. It was actively interpreted as an admission of guilt. The pressure began to mount with terrifying speed. She was completely cornered by the legacy she had constructed, forced out of her elite cultural sanctuary and directly into the center of a viral reckoning, setting the stage for a catastrophic psychological break. By early 2015, the absolute silence that Phylicia Rashad had cultivated as a survival mechanism was no longer tenable. The digital reckoning had successfully breached the walls of her theatrical sanctuary, pulling her out of the elite, insulated world of Broadway and directly into the center of a global media firestorm. The press was no longer asking polite questions about her stagecraft. They were aggressively demanding accountability for her 30-year tenure as the ultimate character witness to a collapsing empire. The public pressure was suffocating. Every time she stepped out of her home or attended an industry event, she was relentlessly pursued for a soundbite. The media required her to reconcile the horrifying forensic reality of the dozens of women stepping forward with the flawless fiction she had helped project to the world. She was cornered by the digital footprint of her own highly profitable performance. The psychological strain of carrying the weight of a shattered cultural monument finally forced her to speak. And when she did, she delivered a masterclass in institutional cruelty. The setting for this catastrophic fracture was a seemingly safe, elite industry luncheon. It was the exact type of highly curated environment where Rashad was accustomed to operating with total control and deference. But the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. When a reporter from Showbiz 411 approached her and inevitably breached the subject of the mounting allegations, Rashad did not offer a carefully vetted, neutral public relations statement. She did not express a standard corporate empathy for the alleged victims while waiting for the legal process to unfold. Instead, she offered a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the terrifying psychological contract she had signed in the 1980s. She looked at the reporter and dismissed the dozens of accusers with a phrase that would instantly and permanently define her legacy. She stated with absolute, chilling precision, "Forget these women. What you're seeing is the destruction of a legacy. I think it's orchestrated." To truly understand the trauma and the systemic danger embedded in that statement, one must deconstruct its underlying ideology. "Forget these women" was not a mere slip of the tongue. It was an ideological reflex. It was the verbal manifestation of a corporate mindset that views human collateral as an entirely acceptable loss for the preservation of $1 billion intellectual property. By explicitly commanding the public to forget the accusers, she was actively attempting to erase the humanity, the suffering, and the lived reality of the survivors. She was demanding that the public prioritize a television show, a manufactured fictional product designed to generate advertising revenue, over the lives of actual human beings who had been systematically exploited. In her mind, the institution of the sitcom and the cultural milestone it represented were vastly more important than the women who were crushed beneath its foundation. She chose to fiercely defend the real estate of the brand over the reality of the crimes. The second half of her statement, claiming the exposure of the predator was an orchestrated destruction of a legacy, reveals the darkest mechanism of institutional defense. When powerful entities are finally confronted with undeniable evidence of their own corruption, their immediate instinct is to attack the whistleblowers. Rashad weaponized the collective trauma of the victims, framing their brave, unified decision to step forward not as a long overdue pursuit of justice, but as a malicious, coordinated conspiracy. This is a classic, brutal tactic designed to deflect accountability. By framing her former co-star as the true victim of a shadowy plot, she attempted to invalidate the forensic consistency of the allegations. She demonstrated a profound moral bankruptcy, proving that for those who benefit massively from a corrupted system, the exposure of the corruption is consistently viewed as a greater crime than the corruption itself. She was protecting the fortress, attacking anyone who dared to point out that the fortress was built on a graveyard. The psychological impact of this specific interview on the viewing public was catastrophic. For the demographic of mature viewers who had spent 30 years watching her navigate family conflicts with unmatched dignity, intelligence, and grace, this was an intimate, devastating betrayal. They had trusted her. They had viewed her not just as an actress, but as a maternal archetype and a pioneer of modern feminism on television. She had taught an entire generation how to demand respect, how to establish boundaries, and how to operate with absolute authority. To watch that same woman actively, coldly invalidate victims of systematic manipulation was a brutal psychological blow. The audience was forced to confront a terrifying reality about the entertainment industry. The system is so ruthlessly efficient that it can train brilliant, powerful women to act as the final, most vicious line of defense for the very men who exploit others. The illusion of Claire Huxtable was finally, unequivocally dead, killed by the actress who played her. The ultimate tragedy of Phylicia Rashad's conditioning lies in the specific nature of the legacy she was trying to protect. The 1980s sitcom was not just a comedy. It was a groundbreaking representation of Black excellence and upward mobility on global television. It shifted cultural paradigms and provided profound positive representation. Rashad was acutely aware of this historical significance. However, the fatal flaw in her psychology was the absolute conflation of this vital cultural milestone with the fundamentally compromised man who built it. She decided that the historical monument of the television show was simply too important to fall, even if the foundation was entirely rotten. She became the ultimate company man, proving that when an individual's financial security, historical relevance, and public identity are entirely tethered to a massive corporate fiction, they will fiercely defend that fiction against any truth, no matter how much collateral damage they inflict in the process. The fallout from that catastrophic industry luncheon did not halt the slow, inevitable grind of the justice system. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict, fueled by the digital avalanche of testimonies. But the legal machinery required an agonizingly precise dismantling of the myth. By the time the criminal trial commenced in Montgomery County, In the spring of 2018, the protective corporate bubble had completely evaporated. The television networks had severed their syndication contracts, effectively turning off the financial oxygen supply that had funded the cover-up for 30 years. Bill Cosby walked into that courthouse stripped of his television lighting, his studio audience, and the heavily financed corporate handlers who had previously sanitized his environment. He was no longer a network savior, dictating terms to terrified executives. He was a criminal defendant facing the undeniable documented weight of forensic evidence and sworn victim testimony. The physical contrast between the Brooklyn soundstage and the Pennsylvania courtroom provided a stark visual representation of the collapsing facade. The sitcom set had been engineered to project warmth, safety, and moral absolute. It was a space specifically designed to make the audience and the visiting actresses feel completely disarmed. The courtroom, however, was a theater of cold forensic accountability. There were no laugh tracks to drown out the horrifying details of chemical manipulation. There were no carefully scripted monologues about family values to distract from the reality of the predatory operation. The trial forced the public to look at the meticulous, predatory logistics required to execute these crimes over decades. It exposed the stark reality that the wholesome environment sold to millions was actively utilized as a highly efficient hunting ground. When the guilty verdict was finally handed down, it achieved something far more profound than a standard criminal conviction. It legally and definitively classified the pristine, beloved television brand as a fraudulent construct. The court confirmed on the official record that the moral baseline the American public had trusted throughout the 1980s was a manufactured shield. The gavel strike effectively ended the most successful psychological operation in broadcasting history. The visual impact of America's most revered paternal figure being escorted out of a courtroom in handcuffs cemented a horrifying truth about the entertainment industry. The predator was exactly who the underground industry whispers had always claimed he was. The corporate structure surrounding him had not just ignored his actions, it had facilitated his survival and profited immensely from his manufactured morality. Yet, as the prison doors locked behind the perpetrator, the surreal divergence of fates within this television partnership became starkly apparent. The primary architect of his public alibi, the woman who had fiercely commanded the world to forget his victims, experienced an entirely different institutional trajectory. Phylicia Rashad did not face professional exile. She was not ostracized by the cultural elite for her staunch, unapologetic defense of a convicted predator. Instead, the institutional machinery of academia actively embraced her, offering a level of prestige that cleanly insulated her from the wreckage of the sitcom. While her former co-star traded tailored suits for a state penitentiary uniform, Rashad retreated into the highly respected, thoroughly insulated world of higher education. She was appointed as the Dean of the College of Fine Arts at Howard University, one of the most revered and historically significant academic institutions in the country. The psychological horror of this development cannot be overstated. An elite university deliberately placed the ultimate enabler in a position of supreme, unquestioned authority over young, aspiring, and deeply vulnerable artists. The woman who had publicly prioritized a lucrative television legacy over the lives of exploited women was now officially tasked with nurturing the next generation of creative talent. This appointment demonstrated a chilling reality about how seamlessly powerful institutions separate moral complicity from professional prestige. Analyzing the academic world reveals that it functions with the same self-preservation instincts as a Hollywood studio network. The university administration looked at her staunch, unwavering defense of a powerful man and did not see a moral failing. They saw a formidable, unyielding authority figure fit for high-level administrative leadership. They valued her celebrity, her theatrical pedigree, and her fundraising potential far more than they valued the safety or the psychological well-being of their student body. They calculated, much like the television executives of the 1980s, that the prestige she brought to the institution outweighed the toxic reality of her public statements. The university effectively laundered her reputation, utilizing the inherent respectability of academia to wash away the stain of her complicity. For the mature audience who had spent decades internalizing the moral lessons of her television persona, this appointment felt like a secondary, deeply cynical betrayal. They were forced to watch a woman who had actively invalidated victims of systematic abuse ascend to an academic throne, cloaked in the respectable robes of a university dean. It reinforced the darkest, most enduring lesson of the entire saga. The system will occasionally, when backed into an undeniable legal corner by overwhelming evidence, penalize the exposed predator. However, it routinely protects, promotes, and richly rewards the loyal lieutenant who maintained the silence. The structural cruelty that allowed the predator to operate unchecked in a Brooklyn television studio was not dismantled by the guilty verdict. It was simply transferred, repackaged, and legitimized within the hallowed halls of a prestigious university. The academic sanctuary at Howard University provided a comfortable, highly insulated stasis for Rashad. For 3 years, the cultural narrative appeared entirely settled. The predator was securely locked within a state penitentiary, and the loyal lieutenant was safely tenured within the ivory tower. The system seemed to have reached a grim but stable equilibrium. However, the architecture of extreme wealth and privilege is remarkably resilient. It is specifically designed to exhaust the resources of the vulnerable, while relentlessly probing for structural weaknesses in the law. In June of 2021, the legal apparatus that had finally convicted Cosby found a procedural trapdoor. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his criminal conviction. The ruling was not based on newly discovered evidence of his innocence, nor was it a vindication of his character. It was predicated entirely on a decades-old, highly controversial prosecutorial agreement. The court determined that a previous district attorney had struck an unwritten deal, promising the comedian he would not be criminally charged in exchange for his testimony in a civil suit. It was a staggering, cynical display of legal loopholes functioning precisely as designed for the ultra-wealthy. The justice system did not declare him an innocent man. It simply declared him legally untouchable. Within hours of the news breaking, before the disgraced icon had even physically walked out of the prison gates, the digital world received a transmission that incinerated whatever fragments remained of Phylicia Rashad's moral credibility. On her official social media account, operating under the prestigious title of a university dean, she posted an image of her former television husband. The accompanying text was not a measured statement of legal observation or a carefully vetted public relations neutrality. It was a triumphant declarative shout. She wrote, "Finally, a terrible wrong is being righted. A miscarriage of justice is corrected." This was a raw, unfiltered reflex. The brevity and enthusiastic punctuation of the statement exposed the absolute bedrock of her psychology. For Rashad, the terrible wrong was never the systematic drugging and exploitation of dozens of women in the very studio where she built her career. The true miscarriage of justice in her deeply conditioned worldview was the disruption of the Huxtable brand. She viewed the legal system's failure to keep a predator in prison not as a societal tragedy, but as a triumphant restoration of the natural order. She publicly celebrated a procedural technicality because it allowed her to pretend for one final desperate moment that the television legacy was intact and justified. The reaction was instantaneous and violently corrective. However, this time, the pushback did not originate primarily from anonymous internet critics or rival network executives. It came directly from the foundation of the very institution she had been hired to lead. The students, alumni, and faculty of Howard University erupted in absolute justified fury. The generational divide was catastrophic. This was a young demographic that did not grow up worshiping the comforting myth of Claire Huxtable. They were completely unburdened by the nostalgia of the 1980s. They looked at the dean of their fine arts program and saw an administrator actively cheering for the release of a man who preyed on young women exactly like them. The psychological trauma for the student body was acute and immediate. The fundamental question echoed across the campus: how could any vulnerable student safely report abuse, harassment, or exploitation to a dean who publicly celebrates the legal evasion of the most prolific predator in entertainment history? By pressing send on that tweet, Rashad transformed herself from a compromised Hollywood relic into an active institutional threat to student safety. The university administration, terrified by the escalating public relations disaster and the intense demands for her immediate termination, forced a rapid and humiliating intervention. Rashad was compelled to issue a retraction. She sent a highly sanitized follow-up email to the university community, claiming her initial remarks were misunderstood and expressing a sudden, unconvincing empathy for survivors of sexual assault. But the damage was categorically irreversible. The apology was universally recognized as a corporate requirement, a hollow mandated gesture deployed exclusively to protect her academic salary and standing. The initial jubilant tweet was the unvarnished truth. It proved with historical finality that her loyalty to the man and to the lucrative myth they had constructed together completely superseded any ethical boundary or human empathy. She had crossed the final line of institutional betrayal, confirming the bleakest reality of power dynamics. The enabler will always protect the architecture of the power structure, even when the devastating human cost is staring them directly in the face. The corporate reaction to the legal reversal and the subsequent digital disaster was swift, silent, and clinically absolute. The television networks, syndication conglomerates, and streaming platforms did not issue grand moral declarations regarding the events of 2021. They simply executed a synchronized global erasure. The sitcom, a property that had functioned as a foundational pillar of American broadcasting for nearly 40 years, vanished from the airwaves. This was not a gradual fading from cultural relevance. It was a deliberate corporate scrubbing. The networks recognized that the brand was no longer a nostalgic asset. It was a highly toxic liability. The digital platforms quietly deleted the episodes from their servers. The syndication contracts, once the most lucrative agreements in television history, were systematically severed. The monopoly was officially erased. The millions of dollars in residual income that had flowed steadily into the accounts of the creators and the enablers evaporated almost entirely. This immediate financial excommunication revealed the ultimate, cynical truth about the entertainment industry's moral parameters. The networks did not pull the programming because they suddenly developed a conscience regarding the systematic exploitation of young women. They pulled the show because the illusion of the perfect family had been irrevocably shattered, rendering the product completely unsellable to modern corporate advertisers. The executives were entirely comfortable profiting from a compromised environment as long as the public remained sufficiently pacified by the on-screen narrative. But the moment the Complicity was dragged out of the academic bubble and into the unforgiving light of a global digital backlash, the corporations severed the connection to protect their own profit margins. The physical erasure of the sitcom from television screens marked the end of the most profitable psychological operation in media history. For the audience, particularly the mature viewers who had actively used the program as a moral compass to navigate their own lives and raise their own families, the realization was a profound psychological blow. This demographic had deeply trusted the dynamic they watched every week. They had absorbed its lessons on respect, education, and familial loyalty. To look back at those hundreds of episodes now is an exercise in forensic horror. The audience is forced to reconcile the comforting fiction on the screen with the grim reality occurring just yards away in the studio corridors. The warm, inviting living room set is no longer remembered as a groundbreaking cultural touchstone. It is permanently recognized as the highly sanitized front for a criminal enterprise. The viewers were not merely entertained. They were actively utilized as unwitting participants in a massive systemic cover-up. Their viewership, their laughter, and their unwavering trust were weaponized to provide the ultimate cover for a predator. The final verdict on this television partnership is a terrifying case study in the mechanics of power and institutional complicity. The profound horror of this narrative lies in the realization that a powerful figure could not execute such a massive scale of exploitation without the active, sustained cooperation of the infrastructure surrounding him. The perfect television wife was the ultimate shield. She provided the necessary veneer of respectability that disarmed the victims and blinded the public. Her legacy is no longer that of a barrier-breaking television pioneer. It is the legacy of the ultimate enabler. She demonstrated that intelligence, undeniable class, and sophisticated rhetoric can be perfectly synthesized to protect a deeply corrupt power structure. She repeatedly chose the safety and the prestige of the institution over the survival and the truth of the victims. In doing so, she became an essential architect of the silence. The greatest family sitcom of the 20th century will never be viewed the same way again. It stands as a permanent, chilling monument to the extreme danger of trusting manufactured morality. It proves that the most effective predators do not hide in the shadows. They operate under the brightest studio lights, shielded by the very people the public has been conditioned to trust the most. They build fortresses out of our best intentions and use our desire for wholesome narratives to lock the doors from the inside. We strive to reclaim history by dismantling the illusions sold to us by the powerful. We dissect these carefully constructed narratives to expose the forensic truth hiding beneath the glossy surface. If you believe these complex stories deserve to be brought into the light, please leave a like and subscribe to join our journey through the archives. The shadows of the television age still hold many secrets waiting to be uncovered. Which legend should we examine next? Tell us in the comments below. Until then, remember that the unvarnished truth is always the most devastating script of all.